welcome to all of you. We have a good cross section of people in our audience, just like we have a good cross section on our panel today. And several things occurred to me as I was considering what I might say as a kind of opening remark. The first was this idea, this relatively new concept of the innovation agenda. You know, as a society, we constantly innovate, but I wondered at what point innovation became an all-consuming agenda for us, and therefore something that must not be questioned. I've begun to note that the innovation agenda often comes framed in a narrative of urgency and scarcity and panic. And this is particularly true, I think, with agricultural innovation, which is sold on the popular narratives that it will solve some of the most pressing issues of the day: climate change, world hunger, biodiversity loss, when the reality is maybe it will, maybe it won't, because this is a developing technology. The science itself is changing all the time, and in some places it's contested. And because it is still in a relative period of infancy, it's difficult to identify what place, if any, it will have in future agricultural systems. The second thing that occurred to me as I was thinking about this, what's becoming quite an aggressive innovation agenda, was that, and in the UK in particular, as the debate around wholesale deregulation of genome editing begins to intensify, is that we're starting to see a flurry of articles and pieces in the media, I think generated mostly, I have to say, by the kind of research establishment, suggesting that anybody who questions the innovation agenda is somehow anti-innovation. And I've really pondered over this concept of being anti-innovation. You know, it's very closely linked to this idea that if you question a particular scientific concept, well, you must be anti-science. And it strikes me kind of like being accusing someone who questions the wisdom of breathing in pollutants in the air about being anti-air. It literally makes no logical sense. And the fact is that the quality of our innovation, like the quality of our air, matters a great deal. So questions about the purpose, the necessity, the limits and the boundaries, the risks, the energy use, the amount and type of waste generated, the social utility, the cultural displacement, and the alternatives to proposed innovations are the way that we begin to make sense of innovation and help it either find its place because it is truly innovative, or even deny it a place because in asking those questions, we reveal that it's not fit for purpose. So our webinar today is focusing on agricultural technologies, but many of the questions being posed are also appropriate to the innovation agenda as it's applied to other industries as well, whether it's waste or the production of chemicals or energy generation or transport. Every new innovation needs to be subjected to the full spectrum analysis that takes us beyond simply what's technically feasible into the realm of what's actually useful. So at a time when we need them the most, these kinds of nuanced conversations are no longer taking place around innovation. And it seems to me very important that we try to reinstate them, that we recognize that questioning the so-called innovation agenda is not anti-innovation, it's not anti-technology, and it's not anti-science, but is in fact an essential part of the process of innovation. And so in that spirit, we have brought together what I believe is a really impressive panel of people. And I'll let all of you provide some context for where you come from and why you're saying this today. But with us, we have Nina Holland from Corporate Europe Observatory, Professor Phil McNaughton from Wageningen University, who is a member of the Research, Knowledge, Technology and Innovation Chair Group. We have Solicitor Geert van Kalster, and founder and former executive director of the ETC Group, Pat Mooney, people who have spent career lifetimes looking at this issue from its many facets. And my hope for today is that we can bring a bit of curiosity, a bit of nuance, and the perspectives of what you might call critical friends into the notion of innovation. There's no housekeeping much to do here. We are recording this session, and we'll let registrants know when those links are available, and we hope you'll share them. We're going to ask the speakers to speak first. There'll be a short dialogue between them, and then we're going to open the field up to our participants' questions. So please have your questions ready. You can type them now as you go on. Our first speaker today is Nina.
Thanks very much, Pat. My name is Nina Holland. I work with Corporate Europe Observatory based in Brussels. We are a lobby watchdog organization doing research on different themes. And I'm in charge of the agribusiness sector, which means that we expose the key lobby strategies by the industry. And in case of the biotech and chemical corporations, this often comes down to the strategies evolving around manufacturing doubt about the harmfulness of their products. It can be scaremongering with economic losses or productivity. It can be greenwashing exercises, presenting the industry as an essential solution provider, proposing voluntary action instead of regulation, or using trade negotiations or third country governments to pressure against regulation. All of these strategies are currently being used. We see them in action as we speak in the context of the Farm to Fork strategy and the European Green Deal. But I'm here now to speak about the innovation principle, which is a very peculiar topic that I researched some years ago when it was being pushed by precisely the most dirty and risky industries into the EU regulatory machine, so to speak, in order to create a sort of another level of impact assessment, of cost-benefit analysis in favor of industry in order to weaken regulation and particularly to undermine the precautionary principle. So what is the innovation principle? It was invented by the European Risk Forum, which is a very obscure lobby group consisting of big fossil fuel, chemical, tobacco, pharmaceutical companies. They defined it as a principle that would trigger a new form of impact assessment whenever policy or regulatory decisions are under consideration. The impact on innovation should be assessed and addressed. And in that, of course, the big problem was that innovation was not defined. It was not qualified. No sense of direction was given. So in the definition of industry, when we looked at all the internal communication between them and the European Commission, it became clear that what they understand to be innovation is it could be per patent application, that is one criterion, and otherwise anything that they regard as useful. It doesn't even have to be innovative. So basically anything goes. So it is very clear that the idea was that it would be a counterweight to balance the precautionary principle and other fundamental principles underlying environmental and human health protection law. Because the European Risk Forum said the precautionary principle is inconsistent with scientific approaches to policymaking. So this famous junk science versus sound science rhetoric that the industry has been promoting for a very long time. More specifically, we could see in the documents that the industry targeted specifically chemical legislation like REACH, but also EU rules for novel foods, pesticides, nanotechnology, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and of course, biotechnology. So this happened between 2016, 2018. While at the same time, the deregulation push for genome editing was already ongoing. But of course, we have to see this also against a larger context, which is the severe situation of biodiversity decline. In that time already, the controversy around the insecticides causing huge insect losses was already a topic of very much attention, and now we know that the planetary boundaries for chemical pollution have already been breached, which was recently in the news. So this is sort of against the backdrop and this is the context in which the industry said, you know, we need more privilege and attention for the sake of innovation, whatever the direction, vis-a-vis the precautionary principle or environmental legislation. So that is a pretty radical statement and move on their behalf. Now, when we started to investigate the European Risk Forum and did our first freedom of information requests, they quickly, they both changed their name and they also removed the tobacco companies because since a long time we have a UN agreement that basically bans contact between public health and lobbyists. So basically that should be out of the picture. And when we talked to the Dutch officials preparing the Dutch presidency of the EU that actually catapulted and introduced the innovation principle, they claim to be not aware of the membership of the tobacco companies to the European Risk Forum, which is very hard to believe. They enjoyed very high privileged access. As I just said, they managed to introduce it via the Dutch EU presidency, but also in other EU presidencies like Malta, Bulgaria, they had high-level conferences together with the presidency. So this is really sort of the top-level lobby groups that maybe nobody has heard of, but that managed to collaborate directly with the highest level of decision-making in the EU. After that happened, so the EU member states agreed on the innovation principle as a concept. Then the Commission started to operationalize this into a sort of tool. In the tool is industry regulation. In that there's a toolbox, and now we have this beautiful innovation principle tool whenever new legislation is upcoming. And finally, it was also put into a law, the Horizon Europe law, which is the new big EU research funding program. It also has a regulation with it, and it was mentioned there for the first time, even though there was a very strong campaign against it. Because by that time, of course, the consumer, the environmental, and the trade unions realized what the innovation principle really meant for health and environmental regulation, and started to very vocally oppose it. Internally, in the industry said to the officials, well, basically, what the EU is doing, you are blacklisting substances that we consider innovative, as I said, because of the patents, and that are indispensable or useful. So anything goes. Fortunately, there's a little bright side here. So far, it doesn't seem to really have been implemented because of this controversy, and instead, the industry has started to push for a new principle, which is the proportionality principle, which, unlike the innovation principle, is a real legal principle already recognized in EU law. And they are trying to operationalize and strengthen that principle, basically to do the same thing as the innovation principle, because they do realize that they've got themselves into a bit of trouble with this innovation debate, because it's very superficial and very easy for people to understand that innovation per se isn't good. It's not a value in itself to have something that is innovative. It should serve a purpose, and of course, rather a purpose that serves the public at large and society at large, the environment, rather than just some private interests. I have also been then on the board of a Horizon project that was meant to research this alleged tension between precaution and innovation. And after a number of years, and even under the European Risk Forum was also involved on the advisory board, But the conclusions are very stark of this research group. For 3 years, they researched different technologies and try to assess the tension between precaution and innovation. Actually couldn't find any. And their conclusions are that in their guidance is that such tension isn't actually there, and that the precautionary principle should rather be a compass to legislation rather than precautionary approach being seen as an obstacle to innovation. It should rather steer the kind of innovation that doesn't get us even more into trouble with more new substances or organisms getting into the environment without any proper knowledge about the risks. And secondly, it also says that it should even adopt a more precautionary approach in the risk assessment. So when you look substance by substance or GMO by GMO, that you should look more carefully about to the uncertainty that actually is always there when you have introduced something new into the environment. So we should be very watchful. Please alert me if I'm out of time. I'm probably running out of time, but we should be very watchful in the upcoming battle on genome editing. The industry, because GMOs are not very popular in Europe, have been fighting at least since 2008, or if not earlier, to basically get genome editing techniques completely exempted from EU regulations, trying to define it as not even being GMOs. And in that fight, the virtue of innovation, the use of genome editing to create drought-tolerant crops or to reduce pesticides is crucial to their narrative. It's not only technical arguments. It's very much like we have to deregulate because we absolutely need these crops. Therefore, we have, for instance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation setting up a sustainable agriculture and innovation task force with $1.5 million. They gave that money to a think tank running this whole task force, a very high level, reaching up to the commission level, basically evolving around two elements. One is how can we legally do this in the least problematic way in the EU to change the law? And secondly, how can we demonstrate that this type of innovation brought by genome editing is automatically good and is absolutely necessary for the future of agriculture? However, they cannot really escape, of course, the big problem that the patented techniques will cause a huge increase in the domination of these few seed firms on the global market.
Nina, can I ask you to wrap it up there, please?
I wrap this up by saying, where we have arrived. We now have a Green Deal and a Farm to Fork strategy. And while maybe not everything is perfect, it does mean a huge attack or a huge loss in profits for the chemical pesticide corporations, which are also the seed corporations. And this makes their efforts to promote so-called innovation, like in digital farming and in genome editing, even more acute. And not only to replace some of the profits by these products in genome editing and digital farming, but also their reputation. So to sort of divert a little bit the attention away from pesticides and more to their promised solutions in digital and biotech. Thank you.
That's it. It would be great, Nina, if you could put some links in the chat to the recipes project and things like that so people could see it. Thank you very much for that.
Yes, definitely.
Phil, you're up next.
Great, thank you so much, Pat. I've got some slides. Shall I see if I can find them?
Yes, of course, if you'd like.
Let's see. So how's that? Can you see them okay?
Yes, thank you, yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really nice to have an opportunity to talk to old friends and some new. I think it's very timely. There's a lot going on at the moment in this innovation agri-tech agenda. So it's very nice to develop perhaps more critical thinking in this. So I'm delighted to share this platform, and I look forward to the discussion as well as the talks from my fellow panelists. So what I want to do is look a little bit in terms of the current regulation, this current UK bill that's happening at the moment that I think is very topical and interesting at the moment, then a little bit of what we can learn from history and how a kind of framework of responsive innovation might be helpful. So this may be a sort of a partial response to some of the questions that Nina was very nicely setting up. So at the moment, what have we got? Well, in terms of genetic modification, which by and large is transgenesis, so it's the importation of foreign DNA, the current regulation is really quite strict in Europe. It's risk-based, there's monitoring, there are stipulations for traceability and for labeling. So that's kind of the situation at the moment, although some years back, they knew that risk wasn't really the only reason why citizens in particular areas were so opposed to GMOs. So they gave, in Europe at least, the possibility for opt-out for different reasons. And at the moment, a number of member states have actually, developed this. So GM crops worldwide. So where are they? A lot of them are in the Americas. We can see that. In India, GM cotton, China to some extent, and Australasia. But the main ones are staples, soybean, maize, rapeseed, and what are the most common traits? Well, they're kind of resistant to insects, tolerant to herbicides, and to some extent resistant to plant viruses. So this is one of the big questions which we're facing at the moment. We have this new technology, particularly CRISPR-Cas, that allows new sorts of possibilities, new potentials, is claimed to be quicker, cheaper, more precise. We've kind of heard this rhetoric before, but there's this ongoing discussion, which is, well, is gene editing similar or different to genetic modification? And some organizations are proposing that it is, and others that are proposing that it's not. And there's this very active debate that's going on both in Europe and the UK on this. And here we come to the bill, which at the moment is passing through the UK. And again, we can see these arguments for people who've been involved in this for quite some time. Pat, I know, has been involved even longer than I have, but they're very similar kinds of arguments. So this is George Eustace, Secretary of State for DEFRA, saying outside the EU, we are free to follow the science, okay, to speed up breeding, higher yields, and we have all these fantastic academic centers of excellence where we can lead the way, the Brexit dividend. And again, there's Gillian Henderson, again, with this promise of benefits and precision and improvement. And here we are in the UK, really at the forefront of innovation to make our food healthier and more sustainable. So what are some of the elements to this? Well, science-led, okay, gene editing is different from genetic modification. This new framework can speed everything up. It's part of the post-Brexit dividend. And here we are in the holy grail of less pesticides, greater self-sufficiency, healthier, sustainable food and global food security, and no need for labeling. Well, okay, well, here's some questions. So Where's the vision? Where are the ethics? Not really there, to be honest. Where's the dialogue? Where's the scope for dialogue? Is this really what we want? Well, these are questions that we can reflect on maybe today as much as other things. The bigger conversation, is gene editing different from genetic modification? How do citizens, how do other actors view these distinctions? So I think there's lots of open questions, and indeed a really interesting question. So we're now a couple of decades after the GM controversy. What has changed and what hasn't? And I think they're very, very open and interesting questions, and maybe we can talk about them later on. Is there a desire to speed up the regulation? What are the unforeseen effects? Will the promises be delivered? Have we not been here before? Do we not need more systemic change? And here's Pete Mills from the Nuffield Council Bioethics saying that there's no need for labeling. It's lovely. It's a kind of epistemic erasure, whereby the preferences that many people would wish to inform the system of agriculture production are simply removed from the signals that are fed back through the market. And that might be a site for politics. It'll be interesting to think about this. So going back to the lessons from GM crops, well, one lesson is that there are lots of revolutionary promises that it would help feed the poor, alleviate hunger, address nutritional deficiencies, feed the world, contribute towards better quality food. Well, I think we can say that most of these were not really realized in practice, that first generation GM crops were designed to help the large producer, not really the consumer or the environment or the smallholder farmer. Other lesson is that, well, there was very restricted scope for public and stakeholder involvement and regulation, a lack of formal consideration of non-scientific, socio-economic or ethical considerations. And yet at the same time, a lot of concerns were extended well beyond risk. And there was very little scope for engagement in these kinds of questions. So just to finish, there's a couple of new kind of alternatives. So this is a Norwegian idea that in terms of thinking about governance and regulation, perhaps we should think about more a kind of a tiered approach. And interestingly, we should consider more formally in our regulations questions of societal benefits, sustainability, ethics. So this might be one way. And again, it's like opening up this innovation principle to lots of other kinds of considerations. There are lots of questions about this in terms of what this could and should mean, and who would be on these panels, what kind of competence they would need and such like. But it does seem well worth considering at the moment. And the alternative is, well, in terms of principles, well, perhaps the principles of response innovation might be of interest. So anticipation, reflexivity, inclusion, and responsiveness. And when Nina was talking about principles, well, these might be alternative kinds of principles which are on the periphery of both European and UK and Research Council sort of policy. So what might it mean to have a principle whereby you formally look at anticipation? What might be the impacts of such on different actors? How you might be inclusive? How you might instill more reflexivity, particularly in institutional cultures, and lead to a responsive system. So that's kind of what I wanted to say, Pat. So I hope that might have stimulated some thinking there, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was a really useful rundown of where we've been and where we could go. And it's interesting, these ideas about including people more in these kind of assessments have been around for a long time. And yet we still have not managed to implement them. I tend to think that could be a problem of institutional reflexivity, just the inability to sort of change the way we do things. So that's good food for thought. Thank you. Geert, you're next.
Absolutely. I think you should be able to see my slides.
I can. Can you make, there you go.
Yeah, make them bigger. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, I'll put a little timer on here so as I don't waffle for too long. There's so much to be said about this topic, and I'm really excited with the panel that Pat has managed to convene here, and also by the people in the audience. Now, I've been asked by Pat to focus a little bit on the legal background. That's also because I'm a lawyer, of course, although clearly I have a lot of personal views on many of these issues, and some of those might filter through in my legal analysis. As Pat mentioned, I'm both a practitioner as well as an academic. And in terms of practice, that has been really quite interesting, because I've been involved in some of the delaying tactics, which Nina also referred to. I've been instructed in cases against, well, acting for Spain and other member states who are at the receiving end of the so-called investor-state dispute settlement, where particularly in the area of renewable energy, but also in the area of climate change generally and climate laws, private industry is using investor-state dispute settlement to what is called freeze regulatory development. And of course, as Nina suggested, there's an overall very successful, often very successful strategy, both internationally and at the EU, where industry uses inclarities in the law to try and scaremonger states into not adopting front-running legislation. That doesn't always work, of course. If you look at Australia or New Zealand, they successfully fought the tobacco industry in plain packaging, but of course it cost them something like 200 million Australian dollars, which you can afford if you're Australia, although they've done it grudgingly, but which you probably can't afford if you are Mauritania and would rather build a few hospitals with those $200 million. So it's been very interesting to be involved in both the practice as well as the policy, and I'm hoping that some of the things I'll say today will give a bit of that sort of legal background. Clearly, an awful lot can be said about these things, and you've got my references there, and I'm sure that Pat will find a way to distribute these slides after the seminar. Now, I have authored a paper together with Kathleen Garnett, who's actually at Wageningen, Phil, in the law faculty. So that's someone I think that you may have already come across, or if not, you should probably look her up. We wrote this paper on the mapping the development of this so-called innovation principle, and Nina has given very interesting comments on that paper as well. Of course, a hyperlink to that paper there. And as Nina suggested, this was a real concerted effort to try and move something into EU law and to have it recognized as this quote-unquote principle. So one of the questions that I'm dealing with in this short presentation is whether that matters at all. If you have something in EU law, does it matter whether it carries the label principle? Is it different from something that is merely in a recital, etc.? And the relevance of this lies in this thing called hierarchy of legal norms. So if you think about clashing principles, then two principles of law that seem to be irreconcilable, then to some degree their place in the hierarchy of norms is really quite relevant. And I think you'll appreciate that from very simple examples. If you have a local municipal rule that prohibits people from standing on a soapbox and speaking in a public park, whilst you have a constitutional principle of freedom of speech, then I think you will appreciate that generally speaking, the constitutional principle being a higher norm should of course trump the local municipal rule that prohibits you from speaking. At the same time, of course, that example might also be a good example of how rights can clash, because clearly a person standing on a soapbox probably shouldn't be doing it in the middle of the night, keeping the whole of the town awake, because of course that would clash with people's right to privacy and enjoyment of a private life and so on. And likewise, if the person on the soapbox starts insulting all sorts of other people, then again, there is a clashing principle, because of course you also have a constitutional right not to be insulted, not to have hate against you propagated, and so on and so forth. In all those discussions, it is, of course, enormously helpful if you have a clear principle that is higher in the hierarchy and then a lower principle that clearly clashes with it. As you can imagine, very often either the principles are at the same level of the pyramid, as we'll discuss in a minute, or it is you have competing rights that are at the same level, where one right says something else than the other right, and then of course things get a little bit more complicated. Now, if you look at the European Union, bizarrely, there is no formal hierarchy as such in the treaties. So the treaty doesn't say anything in the treaties trumps anything that the European Commission says in an individual decision. For instance, the hierarchy of principles in EU law has always been fairly implicit. And of course, it's pushed by the European Court of Justice, but it's never been formal. Even the president of the Court of Justice, Professor Leenaas, recently wrote as much in a paper, confirming that there is no formal hierarchy of laws and norms in the EU. But there is this informal one, which you see here, and I've given you the source there, Dr. Vigante, of this pyramid. And that's more or less how we, as lawyers, also intuitively see the relevance and the hierarchy of norms in the EU. You have the so-called constitutional principles, which the court often refers to as primary law. They would be the Treaty on the European Union. They would be of course, the Charter of Fundamental Freedoms. They would be what are called general principles of EU law. I'll get back to those in a minute. And then you have secondary law. So secondary law would be all the laws that are enacted by the EU's legislative process, enacted in accordance with the rules set out in the treaties. So secondary law would be subject to primary law. In other words, if secondary law infringes primary law, then primary law will have priority. And then you have these executive acts implementing secondary law. Those would, of course, be delegated acts. Those would be individual decisions by the European Commission in all sorts of areas of the law, including, of course, of much relevance to today's seminar, things like individual market authorizations, risk assessments that lead to authorizations or that lead to restrictions on authorizations. All those, of course, are the implemented acts, and they, of course, need to act in accordance with everything that's above them in the pyramid. International law has a bit of a special place, and I say that in the seminar with some emphasis because, of course, both in product regulation and in environmental law generally, there's quite a bit of relevant international law to which the EU is bound, and it's generally accepted that secondary law, primary law is a bit more complicated, but for secondary law, it is generally accepted that it should abide by the principles of international law to which the EU or for which the EU is bound. Then there's something which I've mentioned already slightly earlier, which is what if you have two principles that are at the same hierarchical level? In principle, there is this idea that the later law, the later provision, then prevails over the former, and also that the more specific prevails over more general. I think you will suspect that one of the discussions in that regard is for starters, what does later mean? And also what does more specific mean? And there's umpteen discussions about that also, of course, in litigation, because it is not always easy to say whether one specific new directive or decision, for instance, is really part of one area or the other. You'll see on the rest of this slide, I won't go into that, you'll see some of those principles and what they might mean, because I don't think it's so important for the purpose of today's seminar. What is important though is something which Nina already mentioned, is that regardless of what it claimed, the European Risk Forum, which is now indeed been renamed and has now been focusing its attempts on this proportionality assessment, clearly meant for this innovation principle to push aside precaution. At the very least, considering if it were to have been introduced in an article in the treaty, which of course it wasn't, and that's important because the precautionary principle is part of the environmental title of the treaty formally, whilst the innovation principle, however it is accepted, whether it's in recitals or in specific policy recommendations, etc., clearly does not have the same standing as the precautionary principle have. That would require a change of the treaties, and clearly things didn't get as far as doing that. That also, of course, explains why the industry is now very interested in proportionality assessment, because the proportionality principle is in the treaties as an overall general principle of EU law. I have a little side note there on standing rules, but that's important to appreciate. If you think of, for instance, market authorizations that are suspected of infringing this innovation principle, then the industry, which is at the receiving end of a restriction on marketing, that's my clock, but I'll speak for another minute and a half, if you like. Sorry. The industry that is at the receiving end of a market authorization or restriction, of course, has immediate standing, meaning they have the right to take this case to the European Court of Justice. Of course, NGOs, environmental groups, etc., don't have that right. It is notoriously difficult for environmental groups and general interest organizations to try and have standing at the level of the Court of Justice, which is a very challenging practical obstacle to this issue. Now, here is some sort of a fairly simple definition of how ERF saw this innovation principle. And it's interesting to see that innovation itself is only once referred to in the treaties without any kind of definition. And of course, it conjures up the exact questions which Pat and Nina and Phil have also already mentioned, which is what do we mean by innovation? I myself am a full professor at a university that for years and years continues to be labeled Europe's most innovative university, but I have no idea what that means. I understand it simply means that we have the biggest amount of patents and that we have the largest amount of people referring to our patents or citing them, right? But those patents very often apply to things that are absolutely useless, like new wheels on luggage and that kind of thing, and material innovation, which has no societal use, at least. That brings me to this point of the clash with the precautionary principle. ERF claims and their successors claim, of course, that innovation and precaution should go alongside, that there shouldn't be any clash between them. But that suggests that precaution is not scientific. I've recently come to the insight that probably if there is one problem with the precautionary principle is that it is too scientific, that it talks too much about wanting to be at the forefront of science, that it is based on scientific evidence, etc. And the reference here to a paper again by Kathleen on novelty, ignorance, and the unknown, referring back to United States doctrine on frontiers of science, I think will be of great relevance to many of you because it links this idea of science and innovation to some early US case law. This is my last slide and my last 25 seconds perhaps of discussion here. Would it matter if the principle were not indeed in the treaties, were simply involved in a recital? But clearly, again, from a theoretical point of view, something like precaution, although I've just signaled that precaution itself is not easy to implement and is somewhat circumspect if you think about frontiers of science. But clearly, if it were not to be a principle in the treaties, then at least in theory, it would trump anything else like innovation. But of course, in practice, if you start having references to an innovation principle in recitals of documents, etc., then the European Court of Justice will use that as an interpretive means to apply existing laws like biotech regulation, like market authorizations, etc. I finish by saying that if you're interested in the general principles element of this analysis, then we have a paper coming up probably in the autumn where we look at principles in energy law. But that's it for now, and I apologize, Pat, for having exceeded time a little bit.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much for that. That was quite a whirlwind. Trying to keep up with the law, but I may come back to you, I think, with some questions about patents, because I thought that point was interesting. But also, you explained something I think very clearly, which I hope our audience caught, which is the way that the shift has gone from innovation to proportionality, because we're seeing that very clearly here in the UK at the moment. All the language is about proportionate regulation. So that's very helpful. Thank you. Pat Mooney, welcome. We're very glad to have you here today, and you are wrapping up this part of the session. So welcome.
Well, thank you. And I must say, I'm learning a lot so far. I'm enjoying this very much. I guess I'd want to make a distinction here between different kinds of innovation, and I'll focus in terms of agriculture on industrial innovation styles, where I think I would want to argue that we find industrial innovation highly predictable. There's not much innovation about it. It's you can pretty much project where industry is going to go. And if I just quickly touch on some of the historic aspects of this, I remember when the debate first rose up in the 1970s around plant breeders' rights and plant patenting and so on. We were being told that the technology or the patentability of plant material would lead to enormous improvements in developing entire new crops for agriculture, enormous diversification of varieties and so on, of highly different varieties, but especially new species would be introduced in agriculture. But if we went back, and we did go back and look at the initial plant patent law in the United States in 1930, what we'd seen there was the same promises, that there would be a wonderful blossoming of new fruits and flowers, new species again. None of that happened. There was actually a concentration of industrial work on a handful of plant varieties of fruits and flowers, and nothing new was developed at all, really. And so when the proposals came for plant breeders' rights and standard sort of intellectual property law for plant varieties, it was pretty easy to say, we're not going to see those changes, and we're just going to see, again, a greater concentration of industry in a few crops, and that's it. And that, again, is what's happened. We've seen a greater concentration on basically maize and a couple of other crops. So we should have learned from that, I think. We also, when we were introduced into GMOs, it was, and when the GMOs were first being talked about, I think it was back in 1980 or so, civil society was saying that what we're going to see with GMOs are going to be herbicide-tolerant plant varieties. And that's because we're following the money. Money suggests that pesticide companies will buy seed companies who will then be interested in developing seeds that like their herbicides. And I mean, that literally was being said in 1980, 1981. The crops didn't come out until 1996, but lo and behold, that's what we ended up with, herbicide-tolerant plant varieties and not much else. When those ran into trouble, the next step was also pretty predictable with the seed industry, and that was that as we realized, I think it was in around 2000 or so in civil society, we talked about intragenetics, that what we're going to see, because companies were having trouble with transgenetics, is that they'd recognize that same as human beings share almost all of our DNA with monkeys, and a disturbingly close amount of our DNA is linked to earthworms and fruit flies as well, that given the nature of diversity in species, plant species, it would be very easy to simply change internally the DNA of a plant variety without going outside of it at all. We called it intergenetics. Now it's being called synthetic biology or gene editing. But that was the logical trend. The companies were, again, following the money. They had to get out of where they were. They weren't doing well with transgenics. So the next step has to be gene editing technologies. I think that's again the standard pattern. When we saw a few years ago mergers erupting with the biggest seed and chemical companies coming together into a smaller and smaller group of companies, so we're down to 4 or 5 companies really now. One of the comments from civil society initially was, well, who cares? It's still just a concentration of power in whether it's 6 hands or 4 hands, who really cares? But the real concern, and I think many groups, I think Nina and others have certainly were saying this, that there will be other steps. After that merger is allowed, we open up the doors to just about any kind of size of merger possible, and we'll see new changes with the new technologies and new entrants coming in to take over and greater concentration. And that's what we're seeing now with the biodigital technologies that are being introduced, where suddenly it's control of data, whether it's biological data or other forms of data, market data, weather data. It's still management of data. And that introduces, again, another set of companies who have no particular interest in agriculture at all, but do have a big interest in data. and management of it. So we see IBM with IBM Food Trust now offering data, blockchains, and digital currencies. We see that with Alibaba offering advice to farmers, Google, Microsoft now moving into the field to say we can advise farmers on crop production, on livestock production. We can help them with crop insurance. We can provide all kinds of services through our blockchains and through cryptocurrencies to support peasant production around the world even. And that was quite predictable. That was going to move in that direction, and it has moved in that direction. So again, there's not much innovation there. It's just a matter of following the money, just seeing where is largely going to take us, and that place is very much a dangerous place. We have other steps we have to watch out for in the future as well, though, because as we start to see the control over digital information, the ability of companies to move that information around for their own interests, we see the major, big, giant asset management companies, BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard and so on, have become the big actors in advising and looking into what the companies are doing, and starting to feel their weight and exercising great more influence than we thought that you could in the past. And of course, they've grown very much bigger in the last few years because of their ability to manage that information. So the trend line in agriculture, I think, is that kind of concentration of control of all of the aspects of the food chain. And it's also, of course, as companies talk about climate smart agriculture, it creates a special problem, I think, for us in the future. As that conversation goes on and they talk about all these elements of climate smart agriculture, we realize that it's really comes down to their setting a sort of a second level of complexity on top of the supply chains that now exist in industrial agriculture. So where farmers used to grow their own seed and save their own seed and plant it and so on. They and had controlled their own inputs and sold to local markets. Over the decades, we've seen that move away, of course, to a large global industrial food chain, which no one seems to understand very well. But with climate smart technologies, with digital technologies, with the transfer of biological information, we are now moving into a world in which the complexities are as great as they are for building a Tesla car or for developing a vaccine. I mean, who would have thought a few years ago, before COVID, that the adjuvants needed for mRNA vaccines has to come from a soap bark tree in the Andes, which can only be harvested for a couple of months every year. And that creates a real supply problem for vaccines. Companies themselves didn't realize they had that complexity in their systems, not the level of decision making at least. Or who would have understood that a few years ago that urea produced in China, which is needed for Russia's fertilizer industry, is also needed for making brake fluids for Korean cars. And so who gets to get urea? Is it going to go to fertilizer, or is it going to go to car fluids, brake fluids? Those kinds of complexities are now being built into the entire food chain in very strange ways. The battle to get hold of semiconductors during COVID, because of the disappearance of supplies, because gamers wanted the best semiconductors and the car companies couldn't get them. Well, those semiconductors are still needed by the biodigital technologies that are going to trying to control agriculture now. They're taking over that. They need those things. The bioplastics that were needed from Texas when they had the storms and terrible weather conditions in Texas last year are also needed by the fertilizer and the agrochemical industry, and they now complicate that supply chain still further. What we need to have, I think, is an approach to innovation which strengthens local supply chains. We need to use the creative capacity of peasant production around the world, working with communities to ensure territorial markets or food markets are as strong as possible. We need to have those farmers having access to whatever seeds they want, especially sharing information with one another in different climatic zones as to where the pests and diseases are, how they're affecting their crops and their livestock, how to access other farmers' varieties and breeds to adapt to their own local conditions to manage climate change. That kind of innovation is urgently required, and that kind of communication among peasant organizations and producers around the world is absolutely critical. That can make short supply chains and food security and food sovereignty at the local level really viable. That's where we need to go. What we're doing instead with climate smart agriculture is we're again adding a second layer of complexity to an already overburdened food supply chain that shouldn't be functioning so globally. Maybe I can just leave that for now, and we can join in the conversation.
Thank you, Pat. That's really interesting. I mean, as everybody was talking, a few questions came up around this kind of local, natural, small, artisanal, et cetera, and maybe that's a discussion that the panel could have. I mean, one question is, as long as an organism, a genetically modified organism, say, is patented, how can it then be used at the local level? I know there are some proposals for that, but still the patent holder still controls all the levers in terms of who gets to use what and for how long. And the other thing was whether something that is patented can actually be considered natural. That's a question that's swirling around in the UK at the moment, since the current proposed legislation deregulates what it says are naturally occurring GMOs, but almost all GMOs are falling under that category according to the definitions. And then the wrap up for that, and then I'll just let you guys have a conversation, is, you know, given all that, maybe Phil could say a bit more about what that framework for responsible innovation looks like, that sort of ties all that together. So who would like to start? Cute.
Yeah, just very briefly on the link with intellectual property. I think it's absolutely fascinating and completely understudied, because of course in intellectual property law, for which I don't know too much, so I can talk about it with great confidence. Intellectual property law, the one thing you need is moving beyond the state of the art, right? You need to show that you're doing something new. How exactly you can do that if something builds upon natural knowledge is really a bit of a mystery, to me. And I know that others with much more intellectual property rights backgrounds are thinking about this. So I think that's a very crucial link. I have at the moment, for those that are interested, a PhD student who's doing very interesting but difficult work on public interest claims in patent applications. So she's going through thousands of patent applications with a sort of self-developed software program that make public interest claims, and then we need to think of a way of selecting a number of those to try and assess the actual public interest of the technology once it was patented in practice. We're not quite sure how we're going to do this, but it's an interesting thing to think about, and that link I think is really quite important.
Do you mean order public? Is that the concept that she's looking
at? No, not the concept of blocking patents on the basis of them being incompatible with public order. No, it is claims made in patents, claims of public interest. So there's quite a lot of patent applications that say you should grant us because we're going to make formidable progress in cancer treatment, which is going to be generally useful. And then, of course, once a patent is granted, you never really hear anymore, about what actually happened with the technology. Now, perhaps that was not the best example, because in medical applications, you often do find progress, of course, and it's a bit of a different category. But let's say in technology, in a lot of the Amazon and Facebook patent applications, you find this suggestion that what they're going to do is going to be great for humanity. And then, of course, as we know, what they do is not always great for humanity. So that sort of link is quite interesting to me, but I haven't studied it much. I have to confess.
To me, the interesting area to look at. Sorry,
Pat. Phil's got a hand up. Sorry. You guys can just kick in, by the way. You don't have to raise a hand.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, Pat. So, just to respond to your point about the responsible innovation framework, I mean, I think the way that I see it is that, you know, I mean, people like, you know, Pat Mooney and others, they've been raising in a wonderful way, you know, issues surrounding, you know, power and concentration and whatever else, and follow the money, you know, and these dynamics, and Pat's been saying this for, I don't know, 3-4 decades or so, which is brilliant. But what's really interesting, for me at least, is that, you know, it's what you said as well, you know, Pat, you said, you know, the sort of rigidities in the system are such that you keep having the same debate again and again and again. And, you know, that some things change and other things don't. And there are certain constants here. So one question which we have really is that why is the governance of innovation debate been so static for so long? Okay. And one reason is because it's followed a kind of reductionist sort of risk-based framework, which basically says, unless you can identify a risk in advance, you let, you know, the market decide, broadly speaking. And that's been the principle, really. So to say about responsible innovation framework is this is trying to kind of, you know, what my friend, colleague Jack Steele would say, unframe the debate. So it's trying to break the frame, you know, break the frame. And saying, you know, it's not just about risk, and we can argue about whether risk assessment is capturing the risk or not. It's not about that at all. No, it's about ethics, it's about power, it's about concentration, it's about, you know, what kind of world do we want? What kind of agriculture do we want? What you know, who do we want to benefit? And if we don't have those, then the follow the money means that the usual suspects win. And that's what's been going on for, you know, decades. So what responsible innovation is trying to do is to say, well, let's break the frame, let's introduce new principles, let's have ways of, you know, anticipating impacts, including what, you know, innovation would do in terms of transforming life and power and relationships and whatever else. Let's introduce ethics to say, well, let's have a broader conversation about what kind of agriculture, what kind of food do we want, and you know, let's be completely truthful and honest about it. I mean, nobody was, you know, begging to say, oh, please genetically modify my food. That's what I really, really want. Nobody was saying that, you know. And, you know, it was a smart sort of, you know, technology that could do lots of things. And then people could say, oh, it's going to do lots of, but it didn't, because, you know, the money side of it made that it, you know, led to these herbicides, you know, tolerant crops, whatever else. And it's the same with gene editing. It's not going to make any difference, you know, unless you have a way of changing the frame. And that will include questions of governance, it will include questions of the public interest. Response innovation is just one way to open up some of those discussions. That's all I can say at the moment.
Yeah, if I can chip in, I mean, the debates in media and on social media are heating up incredibly right now on all issues to do with food and Green Deal and how food should be produced. And it's becoming more and more clear to many people, this phrase that says, you know, farmers don't have a business model, they are the business model for a whole industry around it that delivers the inputs and that will then transform the food and produces everything into transformed and processed foods. In addition to what Pat was explaining about the investors and advisors that are behind it. So that is a very invisible model that is all sort of benefiting from the farmers' work. And then when we take a little step aside and look at the chemicals legislation, where it's a little bit more clear as well, unlike the genome editing and the seeds, where everybody still seems to be a bit mesmerized by all the potential and, you know, the climate change. We need those quickly adapting seeds and everything else. But with chemicals, I think it's much more clear to decision makers and to media that, you know, industry, with every battle on one substance that is harmful, after years of denying the evidence, etc., and finally there is a ban on one molecule, by that time they will have 5 or 10 substitutes, this regrettable substitution, ready to go to the market. And you can start all over again, trying, you know, proving that these substances are harmful as well, which they often are. And therefore, since a number of years in the EU, they have been pushing the idea, the concept of essentiality, to start talking about what do we really need. And this goes a little bit more into this direction of responsible innovation, to talk more about, no, we're not going to allow everything on the market just because you've developed it and you think it's an innovative or a good product. No, we are going to look at what is absolutely essential. Of course, industry hates that. And the best indication of that is that on Thursday, there is a Business Europe conference on the new chemicals legislation, the new strategy for chemicals and sustainability that the Commission has. And half of it is about the essential use concept. We're in a completely different situation when it comes to biotech seeds. Like there, the Commission has completely bought into the idea that this innovation can only be good, that we absolutely need it. And is not investing in politically and funding wise, is not investing nowhere near the same amount of resources in organic, in local supply chains, in all the alternatives that alternative innovation pathways or alternative approaches that Pat was explaining. Those get completely underprivileged, and currently they are being under attack. More and more from this productivist rhetoric saying, you know, organic is not productive enough, therefore it's not even good for the environment, and it's not even good for people because it's not good for world hunger. So because industry is now getting hit in the pockets, or that's the threat, they are starting to become more and more aggressive and not even tolerate organic agriculture anymore as an alternative. So the different approaches that we are proposing and supporting are more and more under attack from industry, from the eco-modernist followers, etc.
I'm going to turn over, Lawrence, to you, but I just want to point out to people in the chat, we've just posted a link to a report by an independent watchdog in the UK who looked at the UK proposals for deregulation and said that the business case was, quote, not fit for purpose. Things I don't know, but it's an interesting document if you want to read it, given that we're talking about, you know, this idea that we need innovation because we need to stimulate business and we stimulate markets and et cetera, and there's very little around it, even after 30 years, to show that it's really such a great business proposal either. So at that, Lawrence, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. There was a request for the panelists to comment on a paper. Martin Peck posted the request. He mentioned a paper called Outside the Safe Operating Space of Planetary Boundaries for Novel Entities. And in the paper, apparently is highlighted the point that the increasing rate of production of novel entities with diverse risk potential stretches society's ability or capacity to assess them. So more novel entities, greater risk, increasing volume, increasing numbers. So how can society assess these risks? And the paper recommended reducing this risk by reducing the production and release of novel entities. So Martin asked the panel to comment on that, but I'd like to follow up by my immediate, Martin posted that just as Phil was showing the slide on responsible innovation principles, participation, inclusiveness, reflexivity, responsiveness. Whether Phil, that it seems on the surface very difficult just to ban the production of, or the release of novel entities, or the idea of producing them. But if there was implementation of those responsible innovation principles, that would go somewhere to dealing with that problem that Martin highlighted. Do you think that's the case? And how can you say more about this responsible innovation principles? Does it constitute a framework that can be implemented?
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence, and thanks, Martin. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting, the framework. We actually developed it for the UK Research Councils, and it was taken up by, the Engineering and Physical Science Research Council, and now it's part of their agenda. And then it's been taken up by other, places, particularly, Norway. So it's meant to be a way of sort of asking different kinds of questions and integrating this into the process and practice of innovation. So, I think, it's developing. I mean, it's only been around for 8 years or so, but I think it definitely has potential. I think, responding to Martin's point, I think it's absolutely the case that, that we shouldn't be mesmerized by this language of, naturalness, or, you're just changing the genetic structures from within a particular plant or animal, towards thinking, well, yeah, there, of course, there's all sorts of likely things you might not have thought about, of target effects or whatever else. But it's not just the risk questions, it's the way in which it can transform our ethics, it can transform society, it can transform social relations. I mean, if we think about what GM has done in terms of world agriculture, in terms of who's benefited, well, then I think we should be extremely sort of thoughtful and a little bit cautious in terms of how we're thinking about governing this new technology. And
we can't govern it, can we, really? I mean, we're in a world now where with machine learning or artificial intelligence that we're automating our novel entities. We can allow machines to create novel entities and for pharmaceuticals, or who knows for what purpose, or food, that faster than we have the capacity to understand what's being produced. And that's a shortage of limitation of government, the dumbing down of governments over the last several decades, so they have no capacity to regulate, and certainly the marginalization of society and having a role in that innovation.
I think that's right, Pat. But on the other hand, we can do a lot, and I think we need to develop new competences, and that's why the Norwegian model I think is very interesting, because we can regulate in different ways towards in a tiered way, depending on the level of genetic change, but also to introduce questions of sustainability, societal benefit, and ethics. Is how we introduce them. I think that's going to be really important.
And humility introduced as well. I mean, it was just a few years ago that we thought 97% of our DNA as humans was junk, and now we know better. But all kinds of mistakes could be made with that misunderstanding.
That's precisely why this framework, why we're so interested to bring it at an upstream level. So how do you introduce humility into science at an upstream level, and what might that mean? And while some progress has been made there, much less has been made in terms of actually the formal, sort of tiers of governance, and that's where I think would be particularly interesting, particularly in this domain of gene editing, which is now opening up before us.
Yeah, but maybe what's still a problem is that you then don't compare the different approaches and clearly show who benefits and what kind of world and society you create by promoting this or that approach or technology. Because when the Commission now wants to create some criteria for sustainability, and then it will be quite easy for industry to claim sustainability of their products, because you only look at that product, and they can, claim that farmers can use it. Maybe they'll have one or two sort of poster child charity GMOs that will be free of patenting. They can choose that, and then you'll be up to that to then question that or demonstrate, even when it's not yet fully in being implemented. Like the seeds are not yet in use, so it's difficult to have evidence pro or con. So you end up in a lot of difficult debates. Whereas if you start even earlier and start looking at like what is the most resilient type of agriculture in the face of climate change and in the face of biodiversity decline, like what do we really need to change, then I think genetic modification is probably one of the last resorts where you will end up. Yeah. So when you look at agroecology research, it's so much about local biodiversity, soil, using diversity of crops and of genetic diversity within every variety, so that so that you have maybe a bit lower but always a more stable harvest than when you have something uniform and large scale. So I do see that as a little bit of a problem. And regarding and seeds are going relatively slow. I mean, chemicals is and that could of course speed up, but chemicals is something that is already so mind-blowing. And the EU has a register of 23,000 chemicals that are on the market, but only a few hundred of them are really extensively evaluated. Like most of them are just sort of, tick the boxes sort of registration system, and they just end up in the environment, and we have no idea what the total impact is of all those chemicals together ending up in the environment. And only we're seeing the impacts as we speak. But the risk assessment system, but also the legal system is working very much in industry favor, because it will be harder and harder to prove the one-on-one damage done by one chemical on one organism or on human health when we're all exposed to this enormous cocktail. So we definitely need a vastly different approach.
Can I bring in Gert here, because Gert, you wanted to say something, I think, about the panel question. And I think another question.
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence. I think I'm sort of drawn between pessimism and optimism. I do like to think that there are indeed sectors, and Nina hinted at this, where the Commission, for all sorts of reasons, seems to be going the way of this sentiment of, we don't need all this stuff, right? I think all of us agree there's an awful lot of stuff we simply don't need. The challenge, of course, is that if you try and translate this into regulatory action, it very quickly becomes very, very difficult. In chemicals, this essential use approach is potentially interesting because, of course, it will group chemicals, like Nina suggested. It'll sort of go away from the individual need for assessment. There are some legal challenges to that, but I think those can probably be overcome. In product as well, some of the circular economy proposals, including a right to repair, I think will go an interesting way to translating people's feeling of not always having to buy new stuff into concrete changes, hopefully. Of course, it goes really, really slowly, but then it's very, very daunting to see, as both Nina and Phil suggested, that perhaps in agricultural policy and food policy, that sentiment seems to be entirely absent, because of course there it's very easy to say, this food, this particular new technology is going to save the world and is going to feed the poor. And there, of course, you have perception against you if you then warn against some of the, downsides of all of this. So an interesting way, again, I think, not knowing much about it, is this idea of intellectual property rights and how we could use those to accelerate regulation. I noticed in the chat that Kathleen, who I think was not previously in the chat, is now in the chat. So I know she's doing some work on that, and I think hopefully combined that will bring us more closer to that sentiment which was suggested by the person in the Q&A of the simply boundaries to what we need and what we need to put on the market.
Well, there was a question which Claire put in a question earlier about patents, which maybe you can kick off, Gert, which was that in patents, her question was, in patents you need to show industrial application. How does food fit into that, and the interface with nature? How does that fit within patents? And she was asking for an explanation.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know enough about intellectual property rights to be able to answer that. I fear, but if Claire wants to get in touch, I'll be happy to help her with sources. But I don't know enough about it. Sorry.
Okay. Well, one thing that I just like to throw in as a way of leading on to something else, which is that, of course, people mean different things by nature. They mean different things by principles and reflex participation, inclusivity, and so on and so on. And certainly also, I think Eric Millstone made this point about proportionality. So the question really comes down to, in our discussions in the bigger conversation, we've had discussions with GMO developers, gene editors, and so on, who have a view of ethics and have a view of what is good and bad. Their view of ethics and what is ethical is very different to ours. But they see this as their ethical view. It's their worldview. One is one of the most striking ones is, you're being unethical by denying the world all the tools in the toolbox and the ability to produce as much food as possible. They say this is unethical to do that. So it then comes down to the question of that difference in worldview. So how, an innovation principle is applied, how a precautionary principle is applied, or how a proportionality principle is applied, ultimately comes down to that. Eric Millstone asked the question, if you're applying proportionality principle, what is the denominator? What is the underpinning denominator of describing proportionality and judging it, making the value judgment that implements it or triggers it?
This I think is where this hope probably of the successor to the RF is probably pinned on, namely that if you think about the proportionality assessment, then it would suggest that if a particular regulatory action has too much of an impact on the benefits generally perceived, although I think we agree here that very often we don't perceive them, but all right, on the benefits of innovation, then you shouldn't take the precautionary action, particularly if you take that precautionary action in the face of very uncertain science, right? So I think it's quite clear to me that if you promote innovation to some sort of a principle, which clearly is the is the idea of this whole lobby effort, then linking it to proportionality will make quite a lot of precautionary actions suspect, because you would be taking these against the certain benefits of an innovative revolution.
And they've already thought of a kind of a 4-step test or something like that to operationalize that. So there's sort of a series of questions or criteria that will lead to a judgment that the proportionality principle has been broken.
I can respond to your point, Lawrence, about the contestation of these concepts and what that means, because you're quite right. Everybody can claim to be ethical, or to be developing innovations which are climate helpful or sustainable, whatever else. But I think, the critical point, and this where, I always go back to what Pat Mooney says, who's at the table, who's invited, who's framing these things. And this is the incredibly important work of, you know, of Liz and Nina and Pat and others on this, is to say, well, you know, let's pluralize this, let's bring different voices onto the table. And that's why I keep going back to, well, let's break the frame. So in gene editing, there's a current frame, including by, you know, lots of well-meaning, ethical, you know, plant scientists in my institution who, you know, honestly believe that without gene editing, we're not going to be able to feed the 9 billion, okay? But I mean, of course we can, but the important thing is to how do you change that kind of frame? And these questions ultimately, going back to your proportionality, these questions ultimately are kind of sort of political questions. So I think we need to look at, you know, how do we, you know, embrace, you know, the politics? And that's one thing that I, you know, personally, and with obviously lots of colleagues, why we're so interested in deliberative, you know, inclusive engagement. You know, back in 1997, we did some, you know, work with citizens on GMOs, and we found that the citizen framing of the issues surrounding GMOs were completely contradictory to government framing, regulatory framing, industry framing. There was so much more at stake, which was not given any recognition whatsoever. And it wasn't given recognition because the actors were not promoting to give it recognition. But there was latent issues, and actually this is precisely why ETC and Greenpeace and other, you know, civil society movements were able to make it an issue, because of the latency of issues, and to bring that to the table. And that's what I see to be about, you know, about the politics of innovation. And this is precisely the same kind of debate which we need to inject in terms of gene editing to make it political, because it always is political.
Two very last quick points, Vami, because I think we're running out of time, Pat, are we?
We can run over a little, and Pat, I think, wanted to say something.
Okay.
Well, I just want to throw in that the scary trend that I see now, and I'm sure we're all aware of that, is this trend towards multi-stakeholderism, where industry is saying, let's just get a few of us around the table together, and we'll get representatives of everybody. We'll let civil society be there. We'll let industry, of course, will be there. Governments will be there, South and North, representative assemblage of governments and scientific organizations, and we'll sort it out. Then we'll come back and advise everybody and what our conclusion is. And of course, who's got the power and the control around that table is still the industry with the biggest governments, and their pet civil society organizations are just there to be for show.
No, yeah, that's the critical question. Is it comes back to this power. The inclusivity, whether you're around the table or not, is one thing. Whether they talk in this language is one thing. It's power, and how do you make them accountable? So Christina von Weizsäcker and Angelika Hilbeck both raised questions about accountability and liability. If I can put those together and ask you, because very quickly we're coming to an end, whether or not altering the power levers or altering the power structure can be achieved in business terms by imposing or introducing liability, accountability and liability in terms of legal and financial liabilities to all the more powerful actors. Is this a way of curtailing or bringing about, forcing our responsible innovation?
Well, I mean, when we developed the framework, we were very, very keen to look at responsibility, not simply as accountability and liability, which were kind of retrospective, but also more prospective ones around care and responsiveness. So I think all four need to be thought through in an integrated way. So it's not just accountability and liability, but it's also how do we open up questions about care. And that's where the question about vision comes in. So, you know, what kind of agriculture do we desire? You know, what does it look like? And then the secondary question is, well, what then should, you know, technology, the role of technology in relation to that? So I suppose I just wanted to say that. I think your question, Lawrence, is a really difficult one. And it's, of course, incredibly important. But there's a flip side to it as well.
Okay. Anyone else want to say anything about liability and accountability, and making that part a more direct part of the process, the legal process?
I'd like to throw in criminal liability as well. I think we should be looking at criminal law and going after corporations who mess us up in society. And there's more talk about that now, even around food. The right to food should be protected, even under criminal law. That if governments don't do what they're supposed to do, or companies don't do what they're supposed to do, if Cargill withholds grain shipments to another country and so on, then Cargill management and board should be culpable.
Yeah, I think that for instance, when we have evidence that the pesticide lobby is undermining and really obstructing the pesticide reduction targets that the EU wants to implement, then we should be able to take that, as a case, as opposed to holding a company liable for the damage done by one molecule, by one product, which is extremely costly and hard to prove. Of course, it happens, and it's super important. We've seen that with glyphosate and many other chemicals, but it goes too slow, and it doesn't make a transition towards a different kind of production system. So in that sense, when we clearly showed how the industry is sabotaging the EU's ambitions, I think you can sort of start thinking about how could this play a role in the application or in the future, using ecocide as a ground for criminal action, for criminal law against a group of companies. I think we should really take this more high-level approach. But of course, liability and accountability are super important because it has impacts on investors and on insurers, and so it clearly that should also be part of it. But in the end, it's like what Phil was saying. If we move to a governance system where citizens have a much bigger say at the very beginning of the process of defining the question, defining the problem, and then brainstorming and discussing together what are good solutions and who benefits from those solutions, then you can have a much more interesting and positive outcome. Yeah,
I'll pass things back to Pat, just with one comment, if I may. Earlier on, Gert made the point that his university has the highest, the highest number of patents.
We are the world's most innovative university, apparently.
Okay, now it just strikes me that if one takes the old-fashioned traditional view that universities should be the source of knowledge, of civic duty, social utility, all of those virtues, the idea that universities and university departments, particularly those operating in gene technology and so on, see patents as a key mark of success is a mark of our move away from civilization into something different. And I think one needs to embarrass universities. If universities change their views about patents and narrow advantage, narrow benefit, then we would have a different attitude. We will be able to develop a different culture towards innovation and technology.
Lauren, I have to say, so our university started giving patents away. So, I often am not necessarily in favor of my institute in all sorts of ways, but this was a move. So I think that's a good symbol, and hopefully this will be picked up by other institutions as what to do with patents. Of course, there are lots of other questions.
But patents, I think, are really quite indefensible, and any exclusive monopoly law like that will never really encourage innovation. I think we could easily have a good debate over any proof anywhere in the world that patents have actually produced benefit to society, and I think it's overwhelmingly true that they have not.
Yeah,
So I don't think it's giving them
absolutely.
away, it's abolishing them.
Well, okay, maybe that's the first step, at least it's something.
Okay,
I mean,
the-
yeah, this is totally, you know, the pro deregulation of genome editing. They are the ones defending the patents, but basically, almost everybody wants to get rid of the patents on plant and animal varieties. The farmers do, the smaller seed companies do, the citizens do, everybody does, but it's not on the political agenda. However, a few biotech companies wants to deregulate genome editing, and it's there. You know, there's a public consultation, and the process is ongoing in the UK. It's moving ahead. You know, so it's this completely imbalanced dynamic. Yeah.
Pat,
But
go on.
fortunately, with pesticides, we're on a slightly different dynamic. So that's good.
True. That's true.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, okay. So as usual, just as we all get warmed up and ready to sort of dig into this conversation, we are sort of coming to an end. But I'm sure that a lot of people who tuned in to this webinar probably didn't expect it to go in the direction that it went. You know, the discussion around innovation is often kept at a very low level. Is it a good idea or a bad idea? And yet, you know, that very low level really leaves out some of the most important issues around innovation, particularly around, you know, social utility and how we begin to have a broader discussion about this. I think too often we confuse, we clever monkeys that humans are, we confuse the notion of an idea with the notion of an innovation. And we think that all of our ideas are terribly, terribly clever, and they're all going to make us the most money ever, and we're going to drive markets and what have you. And as Phil said several times, what's the vision there? And it's not entirely clear to me what the vision is. And given that we can't even define or come to a common definition of what innovation is, if there's a real problem with making that the basis of how we proceed as a society, that innovation is all, we must keep driving forward, and we must keep driving forward quickly. Nobody ever talks about slow innovation. Have you ever noticed that? It's always fast. It's got to be happening now, and in a way that stops us from thinking too deeply about it. And of course, when you start bringing in issues of law and policy as well into innovation, you realize that just talking about innovation in terms of good ideas is wholly inadequate to the conversation. I wish we had another hour or two to talk with all of you. You've made a tremendous contribution to this conversation, and we've had, I think, some very good questions from our audience as well, very challenging questions, which you've answered quite well and quite fully in the Q&A. I will save the Q&A, and I will save the chat. And as I said, we are recording this, so we will also make sure that everybody has a copy of that as well, because I think there's some points worth reconsidering and rewatching again. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for participating so fully and giving so much of your expertise. And I hope that we can keep this conversation and maybe going and pick it up again at some point. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Pat, for organizing. And
Yes,
Lawrence.
absolutely.
Lovely to see you all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.